If you can convince them, confuse them. That is what the United States and Ghana did last week. And what am I talking about? 5 out of the 14 people who were deported to Ghana last week from the US have sued the Trump administration in a court in the US. But their case is dicey because of something known as conflict of laws. I'll explain that when we start this conversation. My name is Tony. I'm a Ghanaian writer based in the US. And on this YouTube channel, what I do is have intellectual conversations about Ghana's foreign policy, Ghana's economics, and Ghana's politics. So if intellectual conversations are things you are interested in, subscribe to this channel. All right, let's get back to the conversation. So, 5 out of the 14 people who were West African nationals who were deported to Ghana last week from the US sued the Trump administration in a federal court in the US. They alleged that they were not told their destination until they were on the plane, and they were flown to Ghana aboard a US military plane. They were shackled in chains on the plane and fed with only bread and water for the 16 hours they were on the plane. And when they arrived in Ghana, they were kept in the open-air military facilities in Burma Camp. And even worse, they were deported to countries that the US court had identified were dangerous for them. And so they sued the Trump administration. And what has this got to do with Ghana? Well, in the US, the government or the US government, when they enter a deal with another country, the deal cannot be unraveled by a court in the US unless the deal implicates a law of the US. So, for example, if you follow international news, you know that earlier this year, the Trump administration was sued by somebody called Abrego García because he was deported from the US to El Salvador. And he won, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court asked the Trump administration to bring him back to the US. That is because the Trump administration made an administrative error in the processing of Abrego García. And so that case was specific to Abrego Garcia's situation. But the Trump administration went on deporting people to third-party countries. Some people were deported to Uganda. Some people were deported to Rwanda, I believe. And then some people who are West African nationals specifically have been deported to Ghana. So why doesn't the Abrego García case affect these people? Well, because in the Abrego García situation, the Trump administration made an administrative error, which means that they broke the law of the US by deporting him. However, the 14 West African nationals who were deported to Ghana, the Trump administration went through the right processes. And what is the right processes? The right processes is they entered into a deal with a foreign country to accept these people. And the US court does not interfere in foreign deals that the US enters into. That process is usually dealt with in the political process. And what is the political process? The executive and the legislative deals with cases, unless, of course, like I said earlier, they implicate the laws of the US. So these 5 people who sued the Trump administration went to court, and unfortunately for them, they lost. And the court said the Trump administration did not break any laws of the US, so the court does not have jurisdiction over their case. And what do they mean by jurisdiction? Well, under international law, there is something called lex fori or lex fori, like Alex or fori. So lex without the A and fori without the O. So lex fori means that when there is two jurisdictions being implicated in a case, the various jurisdictions will use their procedural laws to deal with the case. So, because these people said the US government and then the Ghana government, what was the name, tortured them, the US government will have to deal with the US procedural law. And the government will have to deal with the Ghana procedural law. And this is where it gets more complicated. So I would take your time and then follow me with this. These people who were deported after the US court found that deporting them into their home country would put them in conflict or something called non-refoulement principle. Non-refoulement principle is the principle that forbids sending anyone back to a country where they face a real risk of persecution or torture. So, if the US send them back to Gambia or Nigeria, where they are from, they are scared they'll be tortured. That is why the US sent them to Ghana. So the US government said they intended to send them to Ghana, a country where they do not fear being at the risk of torture or, what's the word, persecution. However, when they arrived in Ghana, they were deported from Ghana to the Gambia and Nigeria. Why is that? Because it was the US court that said if they go to Nigeria or Gambia, they are going to face persecution. The court of Ghana did not determine that. So what the US court said is not binding on Ghana under the principle of lex fori. So even though American court said we can't send you back to Nigeria or the Gambia because if you go there, you face torture, the Ghana court didn't say that. So the Ghana court does not have to obey the US court. You understand? So Ghana is a sovereign jurisdiction. The US is a sovereign jurisdiction. So while the US say these people will face risk if they go back to their home country, Ghana didn't say that. So Ghana doesn't have to obey the US court. Which brings us to our second case or our second situation. Our second situation is the US said they entered a deal with Ghana to, deport these people to Ghana. But the government of Ghana, through Sam Okudzeto-Ablakwa, said Ghana did not take money from the US to take these people in. So Ghana does not have a deal with the US. If Ghana had taken money from the US, that would mean that the government of Ghana is entering a deal with another country. And under the law of Ghana, for the government of Ghana to enter a deal with another country, they would have to rectify that deal with Parliament. So by saying that they did not enter a deal with the US government, they are operating under an old law, which is the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol. So you get where I'm getting at. So confusion have become basa. Confusion aye basa. So in the US is saying that they have a deal with Ghana. So the US court should leave them to do what they are doing. In Ghana, the government of Ghana is saying that they did not take money from the US, so they do not have a deal with the US. So they are using an old law to deal with this situation. And this is why law can be fascinating sometimes, or justice can feel like injustice sometimes. Because justice is not morality, justice is legality. Moral, torturing people or putting people in chains is morally wrong. Legal, maybe it's legal. Maybe. I say maybe because usually the military of the US is under the executive. The president of the US is the, what's the name? Commander-in-chief of the US Army or the US Armed Forces. That is why they were put on a military plane. So they are dealing still with the executive of the US, and the executive of the US have the power to deal with that. In Ghana, the executive does not have the power to enter deals. They have to enter deals with the authorization of the legislature. So for Ghana to enter a deal with the US, Parliament will have to be invoked. And Ghana said we did not enter a deal with the US. So now, let me ask you, do you think Ghana entered a deal with the US or not? The answer to that question is not a simple yes or no. It is a conversation that only the people who were in the rooms would have to know. That is like, sometimes, right, law is confusing because somebody will do something. You think that they broke the law, and the matter will go to court, and the court will say, well, they did something that feels wrong, but they did not break the law. So under the principle of conflict of laws, the Mahama administration did not break any law by entering the deal or no deal with the US administration. The US administration did not break any law. So they used a loophole, the fori loophole, to get away with deporting people. And that may be immoral, but it is not illegal. And when you are dealing with governments, morality and legality are not the same. And I just wanted to highlight that because last week I spoke excessively under or about the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol, and I explained how that works. So I thought this week I should expand the conversation and explain why Ghana used the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol. And so if you're interested in the conversation about the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol, I'll put it at the end of this video so that you can follow it. But also, if you are interested in more and more intellectual conversations, you can subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching this video.